This lecture is on Thomas Hobbes, and it will focus on his theory of human nature and the way in which that theory is related to his idea of politics and the state. Who was Thomas Hobbes? He was an English philosopher born in 1588, which means that he was born over 2,000 years after Plato, and yet he, just as Aristotle, had very much Plato in mind when he was writing his political philosophy. He was responding to Plato's rationalism, and especially Plato's utopian, from Hobbes' point of view, unrealistic thinking in the Republic, because Hobbes was, even more than Aristotle, a realist who rejected ideal solutions for politics. He was the author of the work called The Leviathan, which means, in this case, the state. He was born during a period of widespread international warfare, with the so-called wars of religion prevailing, engulfing England and Spain and France and the Holy Roman Empire. In 1588, the year of Hobbes' birth, the Spanish Armada sailed to invade England. Now, this was the great armada of Catholicism. It aimed at Protestant England, and if it had succeeded, it said that we'd be all speaking Spanish today. It was the most fearsome, formidable force of naval power that the world had ever seen. Think of it, 30,000 men, 2,400 pieces of artillery. And Hobbes records that it appeared off the coast of England in April of 1588, just at the time that Hobbes was born. The metaphor that we're using for Hobbes' birth, the way in which this story of Hobbes' birth relates to his entire philosophy, is important. So we want to look at the way in which one of Hobbes' chroniclers, biographers, describes this critical moment of his birth. This is John Aubrey, writing in Brief Lives. Aubrey was a contemporary of Hobbes, and he says the day of Hobbes' birth was April the 5th, 1588, on a Friday morning, which that year was also Good Friday. Hobbes' mother fell in labor with him upon the fright of the invasion of the Spaniards. Well, Hobbes says that that was indeed true, that his mother, pregnant 7 months with Hobbes, living on the southern coast of England, sees this force from Spain suddenly loom off the channel and, terrified, gives premature birth to Hobbes. Hobbes takes that fact as extremely significant. He says that unbeknownst to his mother, she gave birth at that moment to twins, himself and fear. It was fear then that characterized Hobbes' life. He was a very fearful and timid individual. And yet he builds a philosophy, a political theory, that is grounded in this idea of fear in the way that we'll see. The story then of Hobbes' birth serves as a metaphor for his philosophy, with the controlling emotion of his whole system of thought being that of fear, but specifically fear of violent death, the fear that seemed to await the English if the Spanish Armada had succeeded. It's because, Hobbes says, that we're so driven by fear that we seek security and we desperately desire protection. For this protection, we need the state. And the stronger the state, the better it will protect us. The key sanction, then, for the state, the justification for state power, the source of its final legitimacy is this: it can protect us. It can give us security. It cannot make us virtuous, as Plato would have it. It cannot even cultivate within us, as Aristotle would have it, an ideal of moderation and of the mean and those glorious family values that Aristotle extols. Rather, the state can do this. It can make sure, insofar as possible, that we are not visited by war, international or civil war, that our lives are safe from violence, that we will be protected once and for all from the kind of fear that Hobbes lived through most of his life. Because in Hobbes's case, after the international war between England and Spain, there was the fearsome, savage, violent war, civil war, within England itself. Now, Hobbes is a systematic philosopher, influenced by geometry, believing that he has constructed in his masterpiece, the Leviathan, a model of logical development and a theory of human nature that is so tightly systematic that it is a science of politics. He thinks of himself, too, as a physician, as a person who has diagnosed a disease within humankind, and specifically within Europe, the disease of violence. The enemy is violence. And he wants to find a remedy for that disease because he believes that basically all of us desire liberation from violence. We want peace. How can we find it? Well, he argues, first of all, in his theory of human nature, contrary to both Plato and Aristotle, that our behavior is and can never be directed by reason. We're creatures of feeling, of emotions, or passions, and our conduct is determined by what Hobbes calls appetites and aversions. He looks at Plato's and Aristotle's theory, for example, of happiness or of goodness. What is good or evil? From Hobbes's point of view, very logically, methodically, realistically, what is good is that which brings us pleasure and a sense of security. What is bad or evil is that which brings us fear, insecurity. For example, the act of viewing a fire. If we are drawn to the fire, it becomes an attraction, an appetite for its warmth, and we see fire in that sense as good. But if the fire threatens to consume us, if it gets out of hand and burns our home down, then it's clearly bad. Goodness and evil are determined entirely on that basis. There is no transcendental justification or identification for evil and good. They are not determined by sin. They have nothing to do with religion. They're not grounded in the metaphysics of Plato or even of Aristotle. They're determined only by this, the pain-pleasure calculus. Good brings us more pleasure and less pain, and evil brings us the opposite. The first source of goodness, according to Hobbes, that gives us pleasure, the greatest appetite that we can have, is the desire for power. And why should this be? Because it's through the desire for power that we can satisfy, that we can overcome our greatest fear, which is the fear of violent death. If we can gain more and more power and develop a greater sense of security, then we can alleviate this terrible fear that we have of death. But the whole reason that we want power is because we need it to combat our greatest aversion, which is fear of death. That is the insecurity that's born of our own mortality, our knowledge that we're always at risk of losing that which is most precious to us, our lives. That there is violence all around us in a state of war, a threat of war. This is what inspires our anxiety. So as we face this mood of anxiety, our very nature conspires against us because we're innately driven somehow to threaten or intimidate or challenge other people as we strive for more and more power. Now, this isn't because we're naturally aggressive, it's because we're so filled with anxiety. We're eternally trying to gain power because we feel that we must have it for our own security. Hobbes speaks about this in a number of passages, but he's concerned with it in this context of how happiness relates to this careful interaction between our personalities, between desire for power and fear of violent death. He begins by saying in this chapter 11 of the Leviathan, which he calls deceptively of the difference of manners, there is, we must realize, no such finis ultimus, or utmost aim, no summum bonum, greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. That is, there is no eternal state of happiness of the kind that both Plato and Aristotle envisaged. From Plato's point of view, the happy person was the just person, and that was achieved only through the development of a highly educated, sophisticated understanding of these ideals in the heavens that Plato speculated on. From Aristotle's point of view, happiness was generated through philosophy too, and he says in the Ethics that the happiest person was the philosopher, middle-class philosopher, but a philosopher who had given his life to serenity and contemplation of the mean, acting according to moderation. That's happiness. From Hobbes's point of view, that ideal of happiness is too abstract. It's unrealistic. It's utopian. What is happiness, then, from Hobbes's point of view? It's a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of one object being still but the way to the next. Happiness, then, is continual satisfaction insofar as we can gain it. Happiness is more pleasure than pain. Happiness is achieved, then, if it can be achieved, in a state of security. When insecurity, especially from Hobbes's point of view, war, civil war visits us, then we're constantly in a state of dissatisfaction or discontent. And in one of the more famous passages in the Leviathan, he says, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. This is how we're so irrational that we strive for attaining more and more power so that we'll gain greater and greater pleasure, more happiness, less insecurity. And yet, as we've said, in striving for that power, we threaten and intimidate others. And so we lock ourselves into this vicious cycle. Because the cause of striving for power, Hobbes says, is not that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he hath present, without the acquisition of all. So what he's saying is that we strive for more and more power, not because we're greedy or aggressive. It's because we're anxious. We're trying always to alleviate this terrible, gnawing fear of death or of insecurity that we have. It's this fearfulness that is at the bottom, from Hobbes's point of view, of human nature. And he speaks of it in eloquent terms. Man, he says, hath his heart all the day long gnawed on by fear of death or some other calamity. And he has no repose, nor pause of his anxiety, but in sleep. This perpetual fear is always accompanying mankind. It is an elemental fear. It's a primitive fear. It's a fear that we know Sometimes when we contemplate our mortality in, say, the middle of the night, as we lay there wondering when death may come, as we listen to our hearts. I had an experience recently when a student of mine told me how he experienced this fear. He said that he had graduated from Columbia and had taken my course a few years back and hadn't really appreciated this part of Hobbes's theory. He thought that after all, Hobbes wasn't speaking truthfully on this. He was probably just a paranoid concerned with his own mortality and not really a realist understanding the human condition. And then the student said he was unwisely crossing Central Park at night, and suddenly at his throat was a blade and the words, "Your wallet, your wallet." And that student said that first he hesitated, unsure of what he would do, didn't want to part with his wallet, but then he sensed his heart was just pounding terribly in a way that it hadn't before. And so he gives up the wallet. And in the moments after that mugging, he reflected on what he had learned from that experience. First of all, he's a passionate guy, but never had his heart pounded in that way. And he called me and he said, "I want you to know that I've been thinking back about political theory, and I felt understood what Plato and Aristotle were saying, but I never really, I think, appreciated Hobbes. And now I do." And he told me the story. And he said, yes, there is, at bottom, for all of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, this fear of violent death, this concern for our own mortality. It's always there, always present. But you see, this is the predicament that this particular fear inspires. And it's this predicament that we want to acknowledge, because this is the problem that Hobbes addresses. He diagnoses this ill and he prescribes a radical solution for it. The human predicament is that we are all desperately afraid. We're afraid of death. We're afraid of conflict. But to escape from fear in our quest for security, we continually act in the most irrational way. Hobbes looked back on Plato specifically and how Plato had insisted that reason can rule in a personality. And Hobbes feels that that's completely utopian, that reason can never rule a person's desires, that these passions of fear and desire for power, they determine human nature and not reason. And over and again in the Leviathan, he says, reason is a force that can calculate appetites versus aversions. It can estimate the various powers that we have in our personality and how much one vies against another. And as a calculator, it can reckon, he says. But reason cannot do more than that, because reason is no more than a byproduct of the elemental passions that are within us. And so, in this state, in this terrible predicament, as we strive for more and more security, we only awaken more insecurity in others by struggling to get more and more power than for ourselves. And so we appear to others like wolves, but in fact we're really sheep in wolves' clothing. And as sheep, we are insecure, frightened, incapable of breaking out of this state of chronic anxiety. Now, what are we to do in order to achieve some kind of liberation? Well, Hobbes says that we must first recognize our state of nature, as he calls it. Now, that is the basis of our human condition, the kind of life that down deep we either all lead or could lead, and certainly do lead when it comes to something like civil war. In the Leviathan, he sets forth what has become famous for a description of the state of nature. And here it is. Hereby it's manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them in a state of security, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. So this is our potential. This is not some distant state in our remote past. And if we do plunge into a civil war, we know that. If we have the kind of insecurity that we know in one form or another in the United States, for example, with the way in which we accumulate guns in order to protect ourselves, that state of mind doesn't come from an aggression within people who want to have guns. It comes from an anxiety, an attempt to protect themselves. That violence, which is within our own society, and of course not only within our own society, can become worse at any moment. And Hobbes says that there is this fear that it will become worse. War, then, consisteth not just in a battle or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition of insecurity thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time can be called peace. Whatsoever, therefore, is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every other man, and which is worst of all, and this is in its extreme form, there is continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, and this is the purple passage, which is the most memorable line from Hobbes' Leviathan or any of his writings, the life of man becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And this might seem as an egregious overstatement. It's certainly an excellent description of what happened in England during Hobbes' time, when civil war devastated that country. And indeed, it can describe the way in which the United States experienced civil war too, because from Hobbes' point of view, civil war is the worst of violence that generates the most insecurity. Brother killing brother, father killing son. That kind of violence from Hobbes' point of view is so irrational and yet so natural. His diagnosis is that we're capable of this all the time. We're capable of the kind of violence that breaks out repeatedly in our society. And we want somehow to find a way out. Now, the irony of all of this, the key point about the predicament is that, in fact, people want peace. In fact, Hobbes says there is a natural law that applies to humanity. And it says, as he writes it, it's a precept, a general rule of reason, that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of attaining it. And he does, in fact, do this. And when he could not obtain peace, he uses all helps and advantages of war. And that is our predicament. But it's only because we desire peace so fundamentally that we seek war in order to, in some way, as we've said, alleviate our insecurity. This need, then, that we have to express ourselves irrationally in this drive for insecurity, this need has to be met somehow. And how is it to be met? Hobbes says, in his remedy now, it's to be met by entering into a contract that will give us a strong, a powerful state. The contract is Hobbes' device. It certainly alludes back to the contract that you remember in Plato's Republic, Glaucon had set forth. except that in Plato's Republic, Socrates refutes the idea of a contract, whereas in Hobbes's Leviathan, Glaucon's idea of a contract is taken very seriously, and Hobbes runs with it, develops it. He says we must have a contract, and we must set up a sovereign in this state that will have full powers in order to keep this terrible state of anxiety and insecurity in a reasonable, moderate form. Because once it gets loose, once it's exacerbated, we get into this vicious cycle of constantly producing more power that will intimidate and threaten others. The sovereign, then, the sovereign is the solution. He is the leader that will manage to cool this anxiety as far as possible by establishing such power that the Leviathan, this monster of a state, will keep us in a period of peace. The only way, he says, to erect such a common power and so to achieve the common benefit is to confer all power and strength upon one man, or perhaps a small assembly of men. And this will allow us to gain common peace and safety. Over and again, he sets forth this goal of the state. It is to gain common peace and safety. The contract says this: I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man, to this sovereign in the Leviathan, on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all of his actions in like manner. That is, everyone in the state gives up all their rights, surrenders all their rights to this person, the sovereign, as he's called. This done, the multitude so united in one person is now called a commonwealth. And this is the generation of the great Leviathan. Now, when we look at the powers that are conferred upon this one man, the sovereign, in the Leviathan, we see that Hobbes is trying to buy peace at any price, because the price is extraordinary. The remedy for this state of anxiety and constantly striving for more and more power, for the human predicament, the remedy for this is to set up an all-powerful state. And in the second part of the Leviathan, he gives these powers to the sovereign. First of all, to execute the purpose and terms of the contract. That is, to increase the peace, to maintain security, to protect the populace at all costs, to wage war only when it's absolutely necessary in self-defense, where the very survival of the state is clearly at stake. And so there are no wars of religion undertaken throughout Europe. There are very carefully waged wars, if at all. And if they are waged too often, then the terms of the contract are broken. The sovereign is illegitimate because his job is this, to keep the peace. The sovereign has absolute power to punish, that is, to wield complete police power, to legislate all civil law, to ensure total obedience, to distribute all property. And this, when we get to Locke, we'll see a crucial contrast here. And that is, the sovereign has the right to determine what is your property and what is his. That is, he has the prerogative to decide what is public property, that is property of the sovereign, and what is private property. For Locke, this is anathema, as we'll see. The sovereign has complete judicial power, that is, he is the judge of all doctrines, of all opinions. He may censor whatever it deems necessary, including censorship of religion. And then finally, he has the power to appoint his own successor. These powers are so sweeping we cannot conceive of any more authorization than this. But we want to note this, that there is one power that the sovereign does not have, and that is to unjustifiably and illegitimately take the life of one of his subjects, or of all of his subjects. That is, he must not plunge the country into war, certainly into civil war, but into international war unless it is absolutely required. Some critics of Hobbes call him an authoritarian or a totalitarian. I think that he cannot be called this, because I think that he is arguing for a state that is ruling in the interest of each of his subjects. And that interest is to keep the peace, to maintain maximum security.